everybody. This is my first time to do a Zoom that's also on our Facebook Live. So I'm really excited about it, and we're just excited to be trying to reach a larger audience. So hold on, because I hear an echo on my phone. Okay, so thanks so much for joining. My name's Casey Wofford. I am the confidential advocate with our RVSP program, and today is the beginning of a series that I'm leading called How to Be a Decent Human Being. And the reason that this concept essentially came up is because I find myself in a lot of conversations essentially being like, okay, well, why can't people just be decent human beings, like treat each other with dignity and respect and understand that like all forms of oppression are wrong, like just be a decent human being. And so I just felt like this was an appropriate title to the series. I know I talk about it with friends a lot. Like if everyone's just a decent human being, then we could end a lot of forms of violence or at least reduce the rates of violence. And so today we are going to be talking about understanding what defund the police actually means and trying to understand more of that intersectionality piece of why, when we think of defund the police, would that even be connected to sexual violence and bridging that gap. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. I will say I'm recording this via Zoom. So if you have any questions or anything, let me know. If you want to ask me something individually, you can message me privately in the chat, or you can always message me after. My contact information will be at the end. So just a little bit about me. Again, Casey Wofford, I'm the confidential advocate with RVSP. I use she, her pronouns. I'd like to start my presentations with also sharing that I am a white cisgender heterosexual woman, and I say that just to acknowledge that that is the lens that I'm speaking from. My identities impact how I have experienced my life, and I have different identities than a lot of other individuals. And so I think it's really important that we all acknowledge what lens that we are speaking from, so that we can approach conversations with humility, with understanding, and coming from a place of curiosity of other people's lived life experiences, and also to acknowledge that in a lot of ways I have been privileged, and to me also having this series is a way to use my voice and use my identities as well to bring awareness to other marginalized identities as well. And in terms of being a confidential advocate with RVSP, I provide direct support to survivors who come into my office or who reach out, whether that's through the phone or virtually. It's been through Teams. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that part of being a confidential advocate as well is not only supporting a survivor or victim or however they identify when they're in front of me or when I'm talking to them individually, but it's to also really support them outside of when I'm directly working with them. It's to support them through working towards changing our culture to a more nonviolent culture. And I am still relatively new to the movement formally to end sexual violence. I really became formally involved in 2015 when I started volunteering on a crisis hotline and also providing forensic accompaniment to sexual assault nurse examinations. So whenever someone's trying to go get evidence collected. And then I started working at a local rape crisis center where I helped facilitate the training of new advocates. And so that's a little bit about me and my background. And now I'm at UTA. I absolutely love it and really enjoy it. And I enjoy working with all the students, and I enjoy the opportunity to be able to engage in these conversations. I completely take on the identity and the role as well as a bad advocate. Essentially, what I mean by that is that I know that I'm always in the process of unlearning, learning, and then creating, right? So even creating this content today through research, through unlearning and relearning just about our criminal justice system. And I think it's important to realize like I am a part of the culture as well. So I live and breathe sexism, racism every day. We all do because that's the society that we live in. That's the history of the United States, essentially. And so when we acknowledge those things, we can give ourselves some more grace and self-compassion as well and understand, and acknowledge when we need to be held accountable, when something that we've been saying is harmful, and acknowledge how we have historically maybe contributed to a culture that perpetuates violence as well. And also acknowledging that all of our behaviors, all of our language, our words are always capable of producing and working towards more of a violent culture or more of a non-violent culture. And so I embrace the term bad advocate. Like, during the day, I am all about like really everything that I can do to support survivors, of course. And then I can get in my car and I can have like a really problematic song come on that I'm like bopping my head to, dancing to. And I can realize that both of those things exist at the same time, but it's really important to be aware of it, but then acknowledge it's also give yourself the grace to enjoy life and embrace those moments of joy. So today the objectives are going to be, of course, I'm going to talk about RVSP, what we do pretty briefly, but that's obviously really important that you know what we do. And then I'm going to be talking about why we're talking about defund the police and the importance of understanding it. We're going to talk about the history of defund the police and why it went viral. And then addressing some of the history of policing, where it came from, the war on drugs and mass incarceration. I am going to be kind of doing a 101 of those topics. It's a lot. There's a lot of really great resources out there for continuing your own education if you're interested afterwards. I know even for myself, I've been reading this book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. That's been really helpful. And there's just so many great resources. So I'll have those at the end as well. And so for RVSP, we have 3 pillars. So we provide education. So like what I'm doing right now, trying to create spaces to engage in these conversations. When we were on campus, I had like Taco Tuesdays, which was awesome. And hopefully one day we'll be back in a world where we can do a little bit more in-person programming. But for now, we're happy to be adapting. So you'll see even in terms of education, we have on our Instagram, we do coffee and conversations on Wednesdays. We have this series now, but basically, we really just try to promote the education about consent and what healthy, AKA nonviolent relationships look like and what unhealthy or toxic relationships look like. Support. So we definitely provide support. And again, I'm confidential, so what that means and what's awesome about that is that when someone comes into my office or reaches out in whatever way feels the most comfortable to them, they have the right to choose what their own path is to healing. A lot of times people will ask me, okay, well, you're a confidential advocate, so like, what does that really mean? Like, are you gonna come give me advice if I come in? And I always say, like, I am not here to give anybody advice about their own path to healing. I'm here to ensure that they know about all of their options, all of their rights, especially with students. If someone has been through a traumatic event, it's really important that they're aware that we can provide academic accommodations, that we can switch their housing if that's needed. We can access emergency housing if their home environment is no longer safe for them. So our student safety and ability to achieve their academic goals is, of course, a priority to us. And then advocacy. I kind of already touched a little bit on this earlier, but in terms of advocacy, again, not only supporting someone when I'm directly working with them, but really working to create a culture that is less violent, and that includes sexual violence and all forms of violence, as well as working towards a culture where we do have nonviolent relationships, where we do understand what consent means and have like pleasurable relationships, pleasurable sexual experiences. Like that's what we're really working towards, building a culture where we can actually enjoy and engage in nonviolent relationships. So why? Why is RVSP providing a presentation on understanding what defund the police means. And I've kind of already touched on this, but I always show this continuum of sexual violence in my presentations because I think it's such a great representation that sexual violence is rooted in sexism. Sexism is rooted in oppression, and you can see on this scale that there are many forms of oppression, and even with this is not an all-inclusive list. But I like here that you can even see sexism, racism, they're right next to each other. That's just pure coincidence, but they are very intricately linked. And so when we talk about that, we can't end sexual violence without ending all forms of violence. It's very true, right? We can't say, and that's not the goal, right? We don't want to work towards a world that's like there's no sexual violence, but racial violence, other forms of social injustice, okay, but like, yay, no sexual violence. No, we want to end all forms of violence, right? And we just realistically can't end sexual violence without ending all forms of violence. And so all of these forms of oppression are very intricately connected and linked together. And what oppression is when there's a group of people that has power and the ability to discriminate against other groups of people. So they essentially determine that they're the group in power, they've historically had the power, and then there's these like others, these like second class, lower class citizens. And so the way that we see that in sexism is that men have historically had the power. And the way that we see that in racism is that white people have historically had the power. And that's really what we're going to be kind of focusing on and talking about today, like how white supremacy has showed up in policing systems and how it's deeply ingrained in our systems. And then we're definitely going to be reconnecting it all back to how it impacts sexual violence as well, more specifically near the end. So yeah. So what is the hashtag defund the police? Like, where did it come from? So essentially, defund the police, it's not a new concept, but we have seen it gain a lot of widespread attention as a response to police brutality, mass incarceration, and systemic racism. And essentially what it is it's a call to move public funding away from mass incarceration and policing to more community resources. So I know even for myself and for a lot of people, you know, you hear defund the police, and I think a lot of people instantly go to like, oh, well, they want to completely disband any emergency response team. And so people start to have these ideas of the purge come to mind. They have these ideas of, okay, well, if we don't have an emergency response team, everyone's going to go buy guns and it's just going to go back to the Wild West, where like everyone's just trying to protect their homes. And that's really not what it is. All defund the police means is let's take all this funding that goes into weaponizing our police system, that goes into the militarization. I feel like I'm pronouncing that word wrong, but it's saying, let's take all this money that's going towards the police and saying, hey, police, you're the first responders to mental health crises. You're the first responders to homeless situations. You're the first responders to like X, Y, Z. It's taking all those funds and saying, no, let's actually think about this. Let's take those funds and spread them out in the community more, and put them into different programs that will essentially reduce crime rates in general and make the need for policing to be extremely low. And it's acknowledging that funding the police to the extent that we are is not working. It's not reducing violence. It's just not the full solution, right? It's saying we need criminal justice reform. So it's asking for things to change. It's not saying, let's get rid of the police completely. And so this is how it started, right? I've seen a lot of this, like how it started, how's it going? So really it's about distributing funds more towards affordable housing, job training, education, mental health counseling, substance abuse treatment programs. It's just about taking that money and distributing it among other community resources. I can speak to, I work part-time at a domestic violence shelter, and even I work on the hotline, and I've worked on the, like our mobile crisis teams hotline as well for Dallas County. It serves 7 different counties. I worked on both those hotlines, and the amount of homeless individuals that I interact with that have so much history of trauma, the amount of people when working at the domestic violence shelter who call the hotline seeking shelter because they're trying to flee a domestic violence situation, and that we have to turn away because we just don't have enough space is astounding. I know at one point, I think there were like 300 people in a month that we had to turn away. Or during a shift, at the beginning of a shift, I'll get a call from someone. We don't have space, but our space, you know, our availability is changing all the time if someone's leaving or exiting. So I'll say, you know, give us a call back. You know, this hotline's available for you 24/7. So continue to call us back if you need additional resources or to check and see if our availability's changed. And I'll have someone call at the beginning of the shift. I'll have them call a few hours later saying that they've called all the other domestic violence shelters, that they've called the homeless shelters. There's still no space, so they're still just trying to call back and see if our availability has changed. And I just think the reason that I share that is to share, like, again, if you defund the police or if you divest funds from the police into other community resources, like more homeless shelters, like more domestic violence shelters, you begin to see more long-term change and the ability for people to get on their feet more, but that has to come from, you know, federal spending, government funding, and the need to prioritize community resources. And so that is really what a lot of advocates are asking for. What a lot of people think it is, again, is they think it's just completely get rid of any kind of emergency response team. So I've seen a lot of memes, and sometimes I'm so thankful for social media, and sometimes, you know, to see the spread of information that hasn't maybe been researched. And of course, you know, I have to do my own research on things as well. But when you see things spread so widely, that's not the intention behind the message. It can be really damaging. But so a lot of people do think that it's, when people say defund the police, they're like, they want full out anarchy. And they start to imagine these like empty call centers, these empty dispatch centers, where somebody calls and no one's there to support them, no one's there to respond. Or I've seen ones that it's like jokes. Okay, you've reached the police. It's going to be $2.99 a minute for you to be on the phone with us and for people to come out. Like, how do you want to pay for that? And again, that's not, it's not the intention behind the hashtag and behind the defund the police movement. And the reason that defund the police went viral, because again, it has been around, people have been talking about and calling for criminal justice reform since as soon as it was formalized, since the early 1900s. But it really went viral when Black Lives Matter made a statement after the murder of George Floyd, which was absolutely devastating. And it really went viral then because, you know, the video of Derek Chauvin, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name right, of the police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes, that went viral. So a lot of people were seeing this murder occur before their eyes. And that's definitely, of course, not the first occurrence of police brutality against a black man. There's so many different examples against police brutality against the Black community, against communities of color. But when that happened, and it was like near the beginning of COVID-19, and we've had so much more screen time, we've had so much more time to like take in information. And when that was like everywhere, Black Lives Matter made a statement saying, you know, we're tired of seeing Black people die at the hands of law enforcement, be murdered by law enforcement, which is the system that's, meant to provide peace, the system that's meant to protect us. And so that is when they called for a national defunding of the police. And they called, again, going back to the real, what their real intention behind the message is defund the police and invest in our communities and invest in resources that ensure that Black lives will be protected, safe, and not only that Black people can live, but that they can thrive, that they can live a great life and access healthcare, access jobs, have access to the same resources as white people, essentially. And as I mentioned before, police brutality against Black communities and communities of color is absolutely not new. This is a not fully extensive list of Black lives that have been lost at the hands of police brutality. And I even try to be mindful of my language, right? I just said lost. No, these Black lives, these Black people have been murdered at the hands of police. And again, this is the system that's supposed to protect people, but instead there's so much fear around police, especially in communities of color, because historically you see all these stories, you see the media. I mean, George Floyd happened at the beginning of COVID, and I remember even the weeks following, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, like we've just seen so many people, Black people, die and get murdered at the hands of police, even within a short amount of time recently in 2020. And it's just been so everywhere. And so there's a lot of movement, communication around it, a lot of protests happening. It's been much more on the news lately than I have ever seen it before. And so it's been very interesting to see, white people starting to protest as well, be allies, use their voices. And so we see just like a big call to action right now. And so I'm hoping this, oh no, okay. Well, I had embedded this video in my PowerPoint and it appears very much as though it's not going to work because I'm not even seeing that it's allowing me to play it. So essentially, I'm just going to speak to this and then I'll make sure that a link to it is shared through our social media. But essentially, The Daily Show, Comedy Central, I love Trevor Noah. And again, I recommend even, the purpose of this presentation is to get people really actively thinking about, what defund the police, what's the intention behind it, and to do your own research, right? Have your own media channels that you go to for your information. Also look at a lot of various different media channels to see different perspectives and be able to critically think about for yourself what it means to you. But I really enjoyed this conversation that they were having in this segment. The person who's in the middle at the bottom, that's Patrice, a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things that she ends with that I'll highlight on the next slide is really talking about her conversation with Natalie Portman, who's a white woman. And I'll go ahead and move on because the video is just not working. Dang it, technology. But I really appreciated, so she was speaking to her conversation with Natalie Portman at the end and talking really about how policing is so deeply intertwined with white supremacy. And because Natalie Portman, essentially, white woman, was saying, there's this call to defund the police. I heard it. It scares me. I don't understand why we would want to defund the police when they make me feel safe, when they make my community feel safe. And that conversation that Patrice had with her resulted in Natalie Portman being like, okay, maybe I need to do more research. Maybe I need to look more into this. And so once she did, and when she started having conversations about what defunding the police meant, she realized like that while she herself as a white woman felt safe around the police, she realized like my Black friends, family, neighbors, none of them feel the same feeling that I feel. In fact, they feel terrified about the police. And she realized that police are the sixth leading cause of death for Black men in our country. And that's a very shocking and terrifying statistic. If that doesn't terrify you, like, I don't know what would, right? And she just re-examined her beliefs. And so ultimately she could get behind the movement and the call to defund the police, because she started to realize too, it's not about saying, let's get rid of them completely. It is about saying, let's invest in other community resources that can break cycles of poverty, that can break cycles of intergenerational trauma. Like, let's invest in other community resources to really help and assist communities of color to gain equal access to resources. And so she eventually got behind it. And maybe I will completely acknowledge, maybe one of the reasons that that part of the video from the Daily Show, that part deeply resonated with me, because even for myself, again, white woman, I did not have conversations around the police when I was growing up. And I never considered that not normal, right? I was like, I feel safe around them, didn't have conversations, and just never even thought twice about it. If anything, I was just told from like friends, you know, if you get pulled over, try to like flirt your way out of a ticket. Like, that is the message I received about police growing up. And that is definitely not the message that communities of color, that Black people get about the police. And it wasn't until I was in my Master's of Science in Counseling program at SMU, it wasn't until then that I was in a counseling diverse communities class, and we were engaged in an activity. And what that activity involved was we were given these like question cards and then paired up with somebody to engage in like conversations that would be considered more challenging to have. And I got out this question card, and the card said, what conversations did you have around police growing up? And even before I asked the question, I remember thinking like, huh? Like, what? I don't even get it. And this is not that long ago, right? I graduated there in 2018. Yeah, this is like a couple of years ago. And I just remember asking, so I was paired up with a Black woman, and I asked her, like, what conversations around the police did you have all growing up? And she immediately was able to say, like, we talked about this. We talked about, you know, if you get pulled over, if you have to interact with the police, you have to comply to everything that they say, even if you don't think that you've done anything wrong, even if you don't know why they've stopped you. You know, in the car, make sure to have your hands visible. If you're going to reach for anything at all, make sure that you're communicating, you know, exactly what you're doing. Don't make any like quick movements. I mean, there were just so many different things that she told me that she had conversations around at a really young age. And she had two sons who are Black, and they, I think that they were early teens, like younger than 14. And she had already had all of those conversations with them. She was like, it's not an option to not have those conversations, because if you don't, there's a greater likelihood that they will not return home, that they can be murdered by the police when they are out, or arrested, you know, just very quickly. And I had just never thought about that. And that is part of my privilege as a white woman, to not have to engage in those conversations. And that acknowledges that policing is very much rooted in that idea of white supremacy. And so that was very eye-opening to me, and something that, you know, again, we have to realize, you know, policing is not race neutral, sexual violence is not race neutral, like all of these things are very intertwined. And so going off of that, I just wanted to give a little 101, I guess, about the history of policing and how it is rooted in white supremacy, because I feel like if I'm gonna keep making that point, I should talk a little bit more about why. So in terms of policing, you know, when we really started to see patrol groups come about, they were slave patrol groups. And so slave patrol groups really started occurring like even before the 1790s, but this Charleston City Watch and Guard, it was like the first police force that was 24/7 and that was uniformed. And it was obviously in the city of Charleston, and that was essentially a slave patrol group. In the city of Charleston at that time, the minority population was the white population. The majority of the population was Black, and the white population, like the slave owners, plantation owners, were really scared that the slaves, that Black people, were going to riot, were going to be able to take over power and control. And so essentially what they did is they got a group together, a group that was 24/7 and uniformed, essentially like the police, but really a patrol group, to really closely monitor slaves, to really just watch out their every move, ensure that they're not engaging in planning a riot, planning an upheaval of any kinds. And we saw during this time period, you know, yes, that was one example, but there were slave patrol groups around the nation, and their main responsibility was if slaves attempted to escape, if they got away, then the purpose of these groups was to round them up and take them back to slave owners. And these were patrol groups, right? In white people's mind, these were groups that were quote unquote keeping the peace. They were ensuring that no riots happened. They were ensuring that slaves or Black people did not gain a lot of power. But what we see it now as is it's white people trying to keep the power. And again, that's systemic racism, that's systemic oppression. And so we saw that, yes, 1790s, early 1800s, there were these laws put in place called the nuisance laws. Essentially what those were is basically they were police forces, but they weren't really focused on crime. These nuisance laws were basically laws that were subjective. They were commenting on people's public behavior. So like if someone was out and really drunk, like think public intoxication, it was saying, you know, that police would make sure that they get back in control. And the main purpose of those laws was that there was a large influx of immigrants, and the main purpose there was, again, that white people in power did not want to lose their labor force. So if police could closely monitor them, could closely say, oh, well, I need to watch them in public, I need to watch their every move to make sure that they're not breaking these nuisance laws. As long as they're being closely monitored, again, there's not going to be an upheaval or a riot or a change or a shift in the power dynamic from white people to immigrants. And during these early 1800s as well, I think it's important to acknowledge, like there were groups such as the Texas Rangers as well, whose primary purpose was to displace people from their land, to displace indigenous populations from their land. And then if we shift more into the early 1900s, I know I'm like going through this quickly, and I wish that we could highlight like so many laws, but it's very in depth. So again, I suggest you continue your own education. But if we shift into the early 1900s, that's when we started to see early drug laws being passed prohibiting the use of marijuana. Where that came from was during that time, there was a large influx of Mexican immigrants, like close to 500,000. So like, again, pretty large influx. And the purpose of these early drug laws was meant to target this Mexican community. It was meant to target like the Latino community specifically, because there was a fear that Mexicans would flood the job market. There was a fear that white people would lose their jobs. Again, this fear that white people have of losing power. And it was during this time as well that Black men specifically were starting to really be portrayed, which they had already been. You know, a lot of Black people had already been labeled as slaves historically. But then Black men were starting to be depicted as like these people who were really dangerous or really high on drugs or had access to so many drugs. And we still see those images in a lot of media today of like Black men specifically being an aggressive male type, engaging in drug use, substance use, or being in cuffs. And that all started, so early on, that stereotype that we still see today. And so drug warriors, or like the police, these patrol groups really were targeting Black men as well. And all of this kind of accumulated in 1982, and it reached a head in 1982 where Ronald Reagan actually officially declared a war on drugs. He said, I'm going to be a lot tougher on crime. We're going to really crack down. And this media hysteria started happening. Basically, it was an unsubstantiated crack epidemic. It was saying like all these Black people are using crack. Black and crack became a saying, which is wild and again, unsubstantiated, but they started to become really hard on the crime sentences for anyone who was caught using crack cocaine specifically. And what was interesting about that is that these penalties were extremely harsh for any use of crack cocaine, but the penalties were relatively kept light for anyone using powder cocaine. And powder cocaine during that time was really more so used by white people. So again, you see these laws being created, you see these wars being declared that are really targeting the Black community, really targeting communities of color, the Latino community. By 2001, over 80% of federal crack defendants were Black, over 80%. And I'm gonna go ahead and move into the next slide in a second, but essentially what I really want y'all to take away from this very, very brief history is that the history of policing really is rooted in slavery and colonialism, which is rooted in white supremacy, and this fear of white people losing power, losing the ability to oppress others. And so I just think that's so important. And I think I'm going to highlight this more later, but every time that I talk about rape culture as well in my presentations, when I'm talking about the history of rape culture, I always talk about how it's rooted in the history of the United States, which is rooted in slavery and colonialism. So you start to see this intersectionality piece that slavery and colonialism are deeply embedded in our policing system, and rape culture, again, racial injustices, sexual violence, you cannot separate them. They are very much connected. And I wanted to just share some statistics. This is from the American Civil Liberties Union. I just found these very powerful statistics, very eye-opening from the war on drugs. And so the first one is just the chances of serving prison time by race, 29%. There's a 29% chance for Black males, 16% chance for Latino males, and 4% for white males, even though white males make up a majority of the male population. And then also 1 in 5 Black men have been convicted of a felony, and we'll get more into why that's important later. And again, white people outnumber Black people 5 to 1 and sell drugs at similar rates according to the research. So this disparity, this racial disparity really shouldn't be occurring considering between the races, the use and the dealing is at similar levels. In 2018, Black people were 3.64 times more likely to be arrested than white people for marijuana possession. So we have tons of people in our prison systems for drug offenses, tons, I wish I had the number on me, but tons for these minor drug offenses too, like marijuana, where some people are being held in prison or in jail for marijuana use or possession, but then in other states it's legal to use or possess marijuana, which is just kind of wild. 1 in 3 Black men between the ages of 20 and 29 are currently on probation, parole, or in prison. So you can imagine too what effects that has on someone's community or these communities of color. If someone is in a family, if the Black male has historically been the provider of the family, if it's a son, dad, friend, roommate, whatever, it definitely has a ripple effect on the community as well. And in 7 states, between 80 to 90% of the prison population serving time for drug offenses are Black people. And that's just crazy. So in every single state, Black people are arrested at higher rates than white people for marijuana possession. And it is definitely not the case that in every single state or I can't even think of one state where the population of Black people is higher than the population of white people. So the disparity is extremely real. And if you want more statistics, I definitely recommend checking out ACLU. They have a great website, they have a great newsletter. It's really helpful information. So why does this all matter still today? Right, you're like, okay, the war on drugs, 1982, how does this still occur? I mean, the war on drugs still very much is real, it still exists, even with the legalization of marijuana in some states, even with like Oregon just recently passed the law, I forget what it is specifically, but essentially making small amounts of nearly all kinds of drugs, a lot of different drugs, legal. But it matters today. You know, I think a lot of people talk about, okay, well, racism, it's gone, it's dead, or like slavery doesn't exist anymore, so just move forward, or like the Jim Crow laws were overturned, they're not allowed anymore. But, you know, if somebody is determined, is branded essentially a felon by age 21, all of the, you know, legal rights that people have gained, right, since the civil rights movement, essentially they're nullified. So yes, in some ways we have like made progress, but it's kind of almost this, it's not really progress, it's more of racism has adapted and changed over time. It's different language, but it still exists. Even if you think about prison visibility, prisons are really out of sight. And if you think about the majority of prisons being populated with Black and brown people, then they're, again, still segregated from white people. And so segregation in a lot of ways is still really occurring. And if someone is labeled a felon before age 21, it's like that's taking away their right to vote. It has historically suppressed the Black vote. It has excluded people of color from juries. And when there's not a person of color, right, thinking about criminal justice system, the court process, if you have a Black defendant, but then every single juror is white, they're not living the same experiences. So you don't have any representation of someone, even with your skin color, on a juror making a decision about your life, which is, again, just wild to think about. So we think that there's been a lot of progress sometimes, but then if we really, really do a deep dive into it, we will see that white supremacy is very much still alive and evident in our criminal justice system in that process. And I love this quote. Again, I'm reading this book right now. I have found it extremely helpful, very eye-opening, that those who do go to prison find little freedom upon release. You know, our prison re-entry programs are very limited. You know, I'm sure that a lot of y'all have filled out a job application before. One of the questions that I ask is like, have you ever been committed of a felony or had a felony charge? And like the brand of felon stays with somebody for their whole life. And I know I've seen quotes or I've seen stories where someone just talks about, you know, it's like they're charged with something at age 19. Someone's brain isn't even fully developed by then. And, you know, just based on their situation, a lot of people have to engage in criminal activity as the only way of economic or financial support. Minimum wage is so low. And then someone's caught for something or caught up in something, gets caught, or not doing anything wrong at all, but then still is subject to arrest. And I say someone, I say, again, communities of color mainly. And then they are branded a felon, and that takes away somebody's rights to a large extent for the rest of their life. And so essentially it's just being stuck and not being able to move forward in a way that gives you easy access to healthcare, to a job security, anything like that. And so it's just really important to realize that our criminal justice system for communities of color, there's so much racial disparity, and essentially what it's doing is it has adapted racism into modern day slavery in a lot of ways. So I've mentioned all this information, and it's all like sad, right? I guess in a nutshell, I would say it's sad. These statistics, this information, none of this should be occurring. I can easily say none of it should be occurring, but it is, right? It's the reality. And so the question becomes, okay, well, this is the reality. So where do we go from here? How do we move forward? And this was a list of recommendations. This was from the 2018 study from the ACLU about marijuana use specifically and racial disparities for people being arrested for drug offenses. And so the ACLU had like a lot of recommendations. That was great. But the main thing I wanted to highlight was that one of their recommendations is divest from law enforcement, use city budgets in different ways, use them more to allocate money towards community resources, mental health resources. So we do see a lot of recommendations when we're talking about law enforcement reform to actually divest and like, let's put the money into community resources so that we can really create more equal opportunities, equal rights for Black communities and communities of color. And I really want to highlight how this all ties back to sexual violence specifically. I think I've honed in on this quite a bit, but again, systemic racism and sexism, they're not two separate issues. Primary drivers of both of these things, colonialism and slavery. Police sexual misconduct, which is sometimes referred to as PSM, it's the second most common form of police misconduct in the United States, and that is after excessive police force. Again, just with police being given the power to, quote unquote, provide peace in our communities and really be regulating our communities, being like the watch group, the watchful eye, when people are given power, and we know sexual violence is all about power and control, if they have that power, then these power disparities result in more violence, and in this case, highlighting sexual misconduct. Something that I thought is really interesting and devastating is that in 2003, the Prison Rape Elimination Act was passed, which basically prevented and said it was a crime for correctional officers and inmates to have sex. But at the same time, it didn't criminalize sex between police officers and people in custody. So again, if you think about power differentials, if it isn't criminalizing police officers having sex with people in custody, I mean, just think about the coercion that's so easily able to be taken place, or the fact that police officers can then rape or sexually assault people in custody and easily say it was consensual and it's not a criminal act. And that's one of the hardest things for our judicial system to prove, is that when someone says, okay, yes, my DNA is in them, all this evidence is collected, but someone can say it's consensual. And if you think about, again, this, you have a police officer, person in custody for a crime, you think about jurors, you think about where that case is going, it is very likely that the police officer is not going to be held accountable in any kind of way. And police, again, having their positions of power, and this is not only police, anybody who has a position of power can really target more vulnerable populations with a greater likelihood of not being held accountable. So the picture here on the top left, that's Daniel Holtzclaw. He was an Oklahoma city officer that was arrested. He had victimized and sexually assaulted, raped multiple women of color who came forward. But it wasn't until multiple people came forward, upwards of 7, I think it was close to 9, and those were the people that came forward, right, to say that he sexually assaulted them. It wasn't until then that he was held accountable. So he was a serial predator using his position of power to target vulnerable communities. And something, I used to work pretty closely with the assistant district attorney of sexual assault crimes in Dallas, Amy Derrick, and something that she would say, and that detectives I've worked with in the Dallas Police Department have said is, vulnerable populations like sex workers, teenagers, women of color, these more marginalized communities, they make, and this is like a quote, this is the gist of what they were saying, it's like they make good victims because they're bad witnesses in the courtroom. They make good victims because in the courtroom they're not as likely to be believed. And that is completely disgusting, because absolutely sex workers, teenagers, women of color, they get sexually assaulted, raped at disproportionate rates, because again of these power dynamics. But then who is being held accountable? And this happens within the police system as well. So that's not specific to the police, but it is very much something that occurs within the police system as well. And race plays a role in consequences and accountability for rape. So even Brock Turner, who was the Stanford swimmer, a white male, he was very successful as a swimmer, and he sexually assaulted someone. It's all like there were multiple witnesses. It was very clear that he absolutely did it. And the consequence that he got was 6 months of jail time. But if he had good behavior, he could be out in 3 months. And then we saw Corey Beatty. They're the same age. They were both 19, who was a star football player at Vanderbilt. Same situation in terms of, for both their cases, there was plenty of evidence that said, like, there's no question about it, they absolutely raped somebody. So all the evidence was there, which we don't even see that occur a ton in sexual violence cases, but like all of it was there. There was just like, they could actually be held accountable, which is amazing that they could be held accountable. But Corey Beatty was arrested immediately, given, I can't remember how many years, but he was a Black male and given so many more years than Brock Turner. And so we see that that's like one case of two people, a white man, Black man, essentially committing the same crime, yes, in different ways, but being given such different sentences, with the Black person being given much harsher sentences. Just, there's no other dynamic there. It's like they have a different race. So it's really important to understand that race does play a role in the consequences that people get. And then the last point I really wanted to highlight was that women of color really get placed in a position where they have to choose between advocating against sexism or racism, and they're kind of constantly having to teeter between both. And one example of that is, when the Surviving R. Kelly series came out, something that people spoke to was, if we speak out against this Black man who at the time was, upheld in the Black community, yes, a successful Black man in the music industry, it's like, if we speak against the Black community, then what are we doing? Are we harming our Black community even more that's already being harmed by the criminal justice system in general? And so there's this constant having to battle between do I speak up against sexism or do I speak up against racism? And how am I going to be accepted by my community of color if I speak out against my own community? Which is really, really difficult in a position that nobody, again, should have to be in, but it exists today. And I wanted to highlight to you, kind of thinking about more recent events. Obviously, Breonna Taylor, again, murdered by police, sleeping in her own bed, and shot and killed. And one of the officers who had responded to her case, Brett Hankinson, he was also charged with, or no, he was not charged. He was accused of receiving oral sex in exchange for not arresting a woman who had a warrant out for her arrest. So again, thinking just about those power dynamics and how they can play. And even after that, and since Breonna Taylor, I think 2 women have also come forward to accuse him of sexual assault. So we know that sexual misconduct, sexual violence occurs by police officers towards the community because, again, that power piece, they have the power to be able to coerce other people. And I want to be very, very clear that I'm not saying all officers engage in sexual misconduct or that all officers actively choose to perpetuate racism, but I'm saying that slavery and colonialism are deeply intertwined with our police system. And when that's the culture that you're living and breathing, you're a part of it. And so I have talked about a lot of different things. And apologize that my Daily Show Trevor Noah video did not work, so I'll have to put a link to it. But this is a list of different books that can be really helpful in understanding, again, more of what it means to divest from the police and what defund the police means. I hope that this presentation has given you some insight into its intention. And I hope that you continue your education so that you can critically think about it for yourself and what it means to you. What it means to you. So this is a list of books. This is also a list of just different news articles, news stories. I always, again, suggest looking at different media outlets to really be able to see a lot of different people's opinions and thought about it. Come from a place of curiosity, learn about it for yourself, so that you can critically think about it and decide what it means to you. But again, I just want to say it does not mean to completely disband the police and not have an emergency response team at all. It just really is focused on investing into other community resources so that we can, end racial disparities and stop the war on drugs and stop police brutality that disproportionately affect communities of color. If you have any questions at all, this is my contact information. If you have any comments and if there's anything that I said that you disagree with that you want to talk about, if there's anything I said that you do agree with, if you just want to process a little bit more about what your thoughts are, where you're at in terms of your own social justice journey or journey for advocacy, definitely let me know. I'm going to be doing this series weekly till the end of the semester. So the next presentation is going to be Anti-Racist Basics. It's going to be next Thursday at 3 p.m. It will be mainly based off of like How to Be Anti-Racist, the book by Ibram Kendi. I hope I said that right. And then White Fragility by Robin. Oh my gosh, her name is D'Angelo. Yes, yep. So, I have read a share of anti-racist books. I'm still in the process of doing my own work. There are times that I question if that should be something that I'm leading, but again, we have to be working these muscles to engage in these conversations and start to feel more comfortable having these conversations. And I think it's important for everybody to have the space to just talk, be heard, listen, again, unlearn, learn, and be held accountable as well. And so, yeah, that's going to be next Thursday. If you have any questions at all, let me know. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I hope to connect with y'all soon. So let's stop sharing this. All right. Well, thank y'all so much for being here. I'm here if you need anything. Bye.